So if you know me, you know I love a good story. I like hearing them. I like telling them. I am the queen of the 10-minute voice memo. Um, and I have friends that will like send me long voice memos back, especially like my long distance friends. And they're always like, that's so long. I'm so sorry. And I'm like, no, tell me everything. I don't want you to leave out any, talk to me like we are middle school girls at a slumber party. I want every detail, every bit of it. I love stories. But there's a story that I've always liked. That is the story behind the hymn, It Is Well. This is a hymn that keeps popping up in like worship sets that I'm a part of, or in whatever way. It's a song that keeps coming up recently. I've heard a lot of like current artists like do remakes of this song, and it's showing up a lot. But the story behind the hymn, It Is Well With My Soul, is so impactful. So now I have to tell you, because it's just this beautifully tragic story. But it's written by a guy named Horatio Spafford, and he was a businessman, a lawyer in the 1800s in Chicago. And he and his family had this trip planned to Europe to board this big French ocean liner and go over for a trip to Europe. Well, he ends up staying behind. There was some business stuff. The Great Chicago Fire happened and messed with some of his investments. And then he was a couple of years later, like rebuilding things, and got held up. And so his family goes on, his wife and his daughters go on the ship, and then he plans to meet them a few days later. Well, about halfway through the voyage, this French ocean liner that they are on collides with a Scottish ship, and within 12 minutes, the ship is completely underwater, taking with it 226 of the 313 passengers sink with the ship. And about 10 days later, Horatio Spafford, still in Chicago at this point, gets a telegram from his wife, and it says, "Saved alone, what shall I do?" So his daughters all perished. He boards the next ship that he can and makes passage to join his grieving wife in Europe. And the captain comes down to his room when he gets to the spot where his daughters perished, and knocks on the door and says, "Hey, this is it. We're here." And he goes up, and as he's looking out over that spot where his children have died, he writes the lyrics, "When sorrows like sea billows roll, whatever my lot, thou hast taught me to say, it is well with my soul." I think about this story, and there are people who you like admire, and you kind of go, man, that faith is just amazing. And he's one of those people, and this story is one of those things. How do you respond with that much faith? It is well with my soul in the midst of that much tragedy and that much hardship. But there's a story in scripture that is not unlike this. But the difference in this passage in 2 Kings is that we don't just get to see and admire the faith of somebody, but we actually get a glimpse into how they got there. How do you have this kind of faith in the midst of such terrible and unimaginable circumstances? So I want us to actually pick apart the first part of the story of the Shunammite woman. This is in 2 Kings chapter 4, starting in verse 8. And just so you know, if you know this whole story, don't give anything away, because we're not going to talk about this part of the story that you think we're going to talk about. We're actually going to just look at this very beginning part. So starting in verse 8, this is Elisha the prophet, who has received Elijah's mantle. So he is now continuing in that ministry, that prophetic ministry. And he has this servant named Gehazi, who's a little bit off his rocker. And then we have the Shunammite woman, and you don't have her name. She's known only for the region that she and her husband live in, but we don't know her name. Picking it up here in verse 8, it says, "One day Elisha went to the town of Shunem. A wealthy woman lived there, and she urged him to come to her home for a meal." How many pastors have had somebody in their congregation urge them, just come out, Pastor, let me cook for you. And you're like, I really hope this is good. Anyway, so She urged him to come to her home for a meal. After that, whenever he passed that way, anytime he went through Shunem, he would stop there for something to eat. So apparently the cooking turned out okay. Verse 9, she said to her husband, I am sure this man who stops in from time to time is a holy man of God. Let's build a small room for him on the roof and finish it with a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp. Then he will have a place to stay whenever he comes by. That's all I want to talk about in this story. There is so much more to talk about in this, story, and we'll get there. But for right now, these 2 verses, how do you get to this point where you can be staring in the face of unimaginable tragedy and say it is well? Well, she encounters, if you know the story, unimaginable tragedy as we get further in, and her response literally is, it is well. But see, there's something that happened before all of that set this up, before anything else. First of all, this room that she built on the roof was not like a tent setup. It was a completely finished and furnished room. Even put a little chair in there for him to sit in while he prophesied. Probably. I don't know what he did or how he felt about the chair, but there was a chair there, and there didn't have to be, okay? It wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a place to be comfortable. So notice what happened. It went from him stopping by from time to time, eating a meal, sharing a meal, to him having a place to reside where he could rest, where he didn't have to hurry. He wasn't in a rush. But this doesn't happen until we get to this one part of verse 9. See if you catch it. She said to her husband, I'm sure this man who stops in from time to time is a holy man of God. Verse 10. Let's build a small room for him. Did you catch it? I'm sure this man who stops in is a holy man of God. Let's build a small room for him. I'm sure this man is holy. Let's build a room. I'm sure. Let's build. Do you see the importance of creating space for holiness? There's a big difference in stopping by and visiting and building space to reside. And I believe God is far more interested in the space that we give him to reside than that we entertain him when we get desperate. Things get really scary, things get really bad. And so it's now, Lord, I need you. Lord, if you would, how many times have we negotiated? Lord, if you would get me through this, then I'll give my whole life to you. I'll surrender everything to you. Maybe God is using that circumstance to bring you to a place of total surrender, but more often than not, we say that and we do not keep up our end of the bargain. In Revelation, talks about how Jesus stands at the door and knocks. And if anyone would open the door and invite me in, I'll share a meal with him. Maybe it starts with sharing a meal, just like it did with this woman and Elisha. He stopped by from time to time and she fed him. But then there was this moment where she was convinced, she was convicted that this man is a holy man of God, and conviction demands action. So what was her responsive action to that conviction? Let's build. When you are convinced of the holiness of God, then the action that we take on the other side of that, I'm going to make space. I'm going to build a room because this is holiness, and I would rather have this with me all the time. I don't want it to leave. I'm tired of coming in for meals. I'm tired of you getting me through my most desperate situations, Jesus, and then I end up desperate again. I want to live in communion with you. I don't want you just to stop by and have a meal and move on. Maybe it starts that way, but eventually you keep encountering him. You're going to encounter how real he really is, how holy he really is. And there will be a moment where the peace that you encounter in his presence will be what you crave for the entirety of your life. I don't want you to stop by for a meal anymore. I'm convinced, I'm sure, I'm going to build space. Stay here, live here, stay with me. Because when you reside with someone, when we reside with the presence of God consistently in our lives, that's where that confidence and that the relationship is built, where we can say, it doesn't matter what happens in my life. I know who my God is because he lives here. He's always with me. I'm convinced. I'm sure. So let's build.